I have been sitting on this bench for 40 years, and you think you have seen every kind of arrogance that walks through those doors. You have seen wealthy people who think money can buy the law. You have seen thugs who think aggression can intimidate justice. But every once in a while, a different kind of arrogance appears, a more dangerous kind wrapped in expensive suits and prestigious university degrees. It is the arrogance of intellect, or rather the delusion that because you are smarter or better educated than everyone else, the rules of society simply do not apply to you. Let me tell you about the morning that Alexander Prescott III walked into my courtroom, 23 years old, a senior at Harvard Law School, the son of a federal appeals court judge and the heir to one of the oldest legal families in New England. He drove a black Porsche 911, and he was here for a reason that would make anyone with a conscience shudder. Doing 80 miles per hour in a construction zone with a posted limit of 25, not 80 on an empty highway. He was moving like a missile through a zone where men and women were actively repairing the road, separated from traffic by nothing more than a few plastic cones. The citation on my desk was clear: reckless operation, endangering lives, and failure to obey a police signal. But Alexander Prescott didn't just accept the ticket and show remorse. Oh no, he did something that only those who believe they stand above the law would dare to do. Instead of paying the fine or hiring a lawyer, he decided to represent himself. He sent the court a 30-page motion before his trial date, citing the Constitution and case law from the 19th century, demanding the case be dismissed due to officer incompetence in violation of the right to travel. He treated this courtroom not as a place of accountability, but as a stage to practice his litigation skills, a real-world exercise for his future career. He treated the lives of those road workers as nothing more than a hypothetical scenario in a law textbook. That morning, Alexander walked into my courtroom as if he owned the building. 9 a.m. sharp. He appeared in a bespoke suit, wearing the crimson tie characteristic of Harvard, carrying a leather briefcase stuffed with thick law books. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't look at the officer who stopped him. He didn't look at the regular citizens waiting for their turn. He walked straight to the defense table, opened his briefcase, and began arranging his documents with a cold, detached calm. I looked down at him from the bench, a young, intelligent face, but eyes that radiated contempt. He didn't look at me like a judge to be respected, but as an opponent to be defeated. In his mind, this was just an intellectual game, and he had already calculated his victory. "Alexander William Prescott III," the clerk called out. He stood up unhurried and adjusted his suit button. "Present, Your Honor," his voice rang out, crisp and articulate, clearly practiced in the style of top-tier litigators. "And before we proceed, I wish to note for the record that I am representing myself pro se. I believe the truth and the law are absolutely on my side." I looked down at the file. 80 in a 25 zone. "Mr. Prescott, you are accused of driving 80 mph in an active construction zone. How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty?" Alexander smiled, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Your Honor, the concept of guilt here is a semantic confusion. I do not deny that my vehicle was traveling at that velocity. However, I deny the legitimacy of the stop and the officer's authority in that specific context. Therefore, I plead not guilty. I have seen many people try to find loopholes, but the way he spoke, as if he were lecturing me on the law, sucked the air right out of the room. You are saying that driving 80 mph between workers who are fixing the road is legal?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I am saying that," Alexander interrupted, "a fatal mistake in my courtroom. that in urgent situations the law allows for exceptions, and I, Your Honor, was in a situation that the law defines as a necessity defense. Furthermore, I have evidence that Officer Martinez failed to follow the proper radar calibration protocols under Section 31-4 of the Rhode Island General Laws. He began flipping through his law books, his finger tracing lines highlighted in yellow. According to the President in State versus D'Agustinino 1982, he started to ramble on. But what caught my attention wasn't his legal knowledge. It was his attitude. He hadn't said a single word about safety, not a single apology, just statutes, loopholes, and arrogance. He thought that Harvard degree and that pile of book knowledge was a get-out-of-jail-free card. Pause for a moment, Mr. Prescott. I raised my hand. You speak of a necessity defense. Where were you going in such a hurry that makes you think the lives of those construction workers were worth less than your time? Alexander stood up straighter, took a deep breath, and prepared to play the ace he believed would silence me and force an immediate acquittal. Alexander adjusted his crimson tie, ensuring the knot was perfectly symmetrical. He looked me in the eye, not with fear, but with the confidence of a poker player holding a royal flush. Your Honor, he began, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial, serious tone. The necessity defense applies when a defendant is forced to choose between two evils. In this case, the lesser evil was exceeding the arbitrary speed limit set by the Department of Transportation. The greater evil was a miscarriage of justice. I leaned back in my chair. A miscarriage of justice? You were driving a Porsche, not an ambulance, Mr. Prescott, who was dying in your passenger seat. Not a who, Your Honor, but a what, Alexander replied smoothly. At the time of the stop, 2:45 p.m., I was in possession of a sealed, time-sensitive amicus brief regarding United States versus Sterling. This document required a physical filing at the Federal District Court Clerk's office in Providence no later than 3 p.m. My vehicle was merely the instrument of delivery for a constitutional imperative. He paused for effect, waiting for the weight of his words to sink in. My father, Judge Prescott of the Second Circuit, entrusted me personally with this task because the courier service had failed. Had I adhered to the 25 mph limit in that construction zone, I would have missed the filing window. A critical federal appeal would have been dismissed on a technicality. Therefore, my speed was not recklessness. It was a professional obligation to the judicial system itself. The courtroom went silent. He had just played the ultimate card, the "my father is a federal judge" card wrapped in a layer of "I was saving the legal system." He was arguing that a stack of papers was more important than the lives of the construction workers he blew past. Let me understand this correctly, I said, my voice dropping an octave. You are telling this court that because a courier service failed, you felt entitled to drive 80 miles per hour, more than triple the posted limit, past human beings who were working inches from the asphalt. You decided that a filing deadline was worth risking a construction worker never going home to his family. Alexander didn't flinch. It is a balancing of interests, Your Honor. The law often requires us to weigh competing harms. The harm of a potential accident, which I avoided due to my superior driving skills and the high-performance braking system of the Porsche 911, was hypothetical. The harm of missing that deadline was certain and catastrophic for the defendant in that federal case. Superior driving skills, I repeated, shaking my head. Mr. Prescott, physics doesn't care about your driving skills. If a worker had stepped out, your high-performance brakes wouldn't have saved him. But let's look at your evidence. You claim this was a necessity. Do you have proof of this filing? I do, Alexander said, pulling a document from his leather briefcase with a flourish. Here is the receipt from the federal clerk's office stamped 2:58 p.m. As you can see, I made it with only 2 minutes to spare. Had Officer Martinez kept me detainee any longer, or had I driven any slower, justice would have been denied. I moved with the requisite urgency that the situation demanded. He walked up to the bench and handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to me. I looked at the receipt. It looked official. Federal District Court seal, timestamp 1458. So I said, holding up the paper, "This is your shield. You broke the law, endangered lives, and treated the highway like a racetrack, all to get the stamp on a piece of paper. To uphold the integrity of the appellate process, Your Honor," he corrected me smugly, "and since the greater harm was avoided, the citation must be dismissed. Lex necessitius est lex temporis. The law of necessity is the law of the time." He turned back to the gallery, buttoning his jacket, looking ready to leave. He thought it was over. He thought he had dazzled the simple municipal judge with Latin and federal letterhead. But there was something that bothered me. Not just his arrogance, but the logic. A federal judge, his father, asking his son to break traffic laws to deliver a brief. It didn't sit right. Judges know better. Judges know that no brief is worth a life. I looked at the receipt again, then I looked at the citation, then I looked at Alexander, who was now checking his expensive watch, clearly bored with the proceedings. "Mr. Prescott," I said, placing the receipt down on my bench, "you seem very confident in your defense." "It is black and white, Your Honor," he replied. "It certainly appears to be," I said. "But in my 40 years, I've learned that sometimes the black and white hides a lot of gray. You said your father entrusted you with this. Personally, it was a matter of utmost urgency. And you went straight from his chambers to the clerk's office directly. I didn't stop for anything, hence the speed." "I see." I turned to the bailiff. "Quinn, hand me the phone." Alexander's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "Your Honor, who are you calling?" "Well," I said, picking up the receiver, "since your defense relies entirely on the necessity created by your father, the Honorable Judge Prescott, and since you claim he authorized this mission, I think we should get his perspective on the balancing of interests, don't you?" Alexander stiffened. "That is hardly necessary. The receipt speaks for itself. My father is a busy man. If the case is as important as you say," I dialed the number, "surely he has time to verify that he sent his son on a suicide run through a construction zone." The ringing of the telephone echoed through the silent courtroom like a fire alarm. 1 ring, 2 rings. Alexander Prescott stood up, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Your Honor," he interjected, his voice losing its polished smoothness. "This is highly irregular. My father is presiding over a complex merger case today. Interrupting a federal judge during proceedings is a breach of protocol. The document I provided is sufficient proof. I object to this fishing expedition." "Overruled," I said, not taking my eyes off him. "If it was urgent enough to risk lives, it's urgent enough to confirm." 3 rings. Click. Chambers of Judge Prescott. A woman's voice answered. "Good morning," I said, leaning into the microphone. "This is Judge Frank Caprio from the Providence Municipal Court. I need to speak with Judge Prescott urgently regarding a family emergency involving his son, Alexander." Alexander's face went pale. The word emergency stripped away his professional veneer. He wasn't a lawyer anymore. He was a child about to be caught by his parent. "One moment, Judge Caprio." Alexander shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He reached for his briefcase as if thinking about packing up and running. "Your Honor, really, if we could just frank." A booming voice came over the speakerphone. It was Judge William Prescott. I knew him by reputation, a man of ironclad integrity and zero tolerance for nonsense. "Is Alex okay? Has there been an accident?" "He is physically fine, Bill," I said, keeping my tone steady. "But he is standing in my courtroom facing a serious reckless driving charge. 80 in a construction zone." I heard a heavy sigh on the other end. "I see. And let me guess, he's trying to argue his way out of it." "He's doing more than that," I said, watching Alexander's eyes dart around the room looking for an exit. "He has entered a plea of not guilty based on a necessity defense. He claims for the record that he was speeding because you personally entrusted him to physically deliver a time-sensitive amicus brief for the United States versus Sterling case because the courier service failed. He says he was on a mission for the federal court." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. It lasted 5 seconds, but it felt like 5 years. Alexander closed his eyes. He said, "What?" Judge Prescott's voice was dangerously low. "He claims he was delivering the Sterling brief. He even presented a stamped receipt from the clerk's office, time-stamped at 2:58 p.m. today." "Frank," Judge Prescott said, his voice cold and sharp, "the Sterling case is a patent dispute. All filings in my court have been mandatory electronic filings for 5 years. There is no physical filing. I haven't touched a paper brief for that case in months. And more importantly, we settled Sterling yesterday afternoon. The case is closed." The gasp from the gallery was audible. The superior intellect of the Harvard law student had just been dismantled by the one person he tried to use as a shield. I looked at Alexander. He looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. "So," I said to the phone, "you did not send him on this mission." "I haven't spoken to Alexander in 3 days, his father replied. "He's supposed to be in Cambridge attending lectures." "Frank, do what you have to do and tell him to call me immediately when he leaves your courtroom, if he leaves." "Thank you, Bill. I appreciate the clarification." I hung up the phone. The click echoed in the room. Alexander stood there, his face a mixture of red humiliation and white fear. The federal judge card hadn't just failed, it had backfired spectacularly. So I said, picking up the receipt he had handed me, the piece of paper he claimed was his ticket to freedom. Mandatory electronic filing. Case closed yesterday. Father hasn't seen you in 3 days. I held the paper up to the light. "Mr. Prescott, you came into my courtroom under oath and manufactured a necessity defense. You forged a narrative involving a federal judge. Do you know what we call that? It's not zealous advocacy, it's perjury, it's fraud." Alexander stammered. The smooth, articulate voice was gone. "Your Honor, there must be a misunderstanding. I may have confused the case name. I handle so much work for the firm, for my studies." "Stop," I cut him off. "You're digging a hole, Alexander. Put down the shovel. You lied about the necessity. You lied about your father, which leads me to the only question that matters now." I leaned forward. "If you weren't rushing to the federal court and you weren't on a mission for your father, where were you going in that Porsche at 80 mph that was so important you were willing to kill someone to get there?" Alexander stayed silent. He looked down at his shoes. He thought if he stayed quiet, I would just give him the fine and let him go. He thought the humiliation was the punishment, but he was wrong. Because while he was playing lawyer, I had my clerk pull up one specific record. A record that doesn't lie. A record that tracks exactly where you were and when. "You don't want to answer?" I asked. "That's fine, because while you were lecturing me on the state versus D'Agustinino precedent, I had my clerk check the metadata on the Easy Pass transponder linked to your license plate. Do you know what we found? I held the Easy Pass log in my hand, watching Alexander Prescott shrink into his tailored suit. The arrogance that had filled the room just 10 minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by the terrified realization that he had played a high-stakes game of bluff and lost. Your Easy Pass transponder record, I said, tapping the paper. It's a fascinating piece of technology. It doesn't care about your GPA. It doesn't care who your father is. It just records time and location. And according to this, at 2:35 p.m., 10 minutes before Officer Martinez pulled you over, you didn't enter the highway from the downtown ramp near your father's chambers. I looked over my glasses at him. You entered from the east side ramp heading south. Now, Mr. Prescott, I may not be a Harvard geography major, but I know the federal courthouse is north of where you got on. Do you know what lies south at 80 Melmadush? Alexander remained silent, his jaw tight. I'll tell you, I continued. Foxwoods Resort Casino. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. He wasn't rushing to save a federal case. He was rushing to a card table. You risked the lives of 3 construction crews, I said, my voice rising slightly. Not for a constitutional imperative, not for a filing deadline, but because you were late for a 3 p.m. poker tournament. Am I close? Alexander looked up, his eyes pleading. Your Honor, it was a charity tournament. It was for orphans. Stop, I snapped. Do not insult my intelligence, and do not insult the intelligence of the people in this room. You were speeding to a casino. And when you got caught, you didn't just accept responsibility. You concocted a fantasy. You dragged your father's good name into it. You wasted the court's time with 30 pages of nonsense motions. I picked up the receipt he had submitted as evidence, the one stamped 2:58 p.m. And this, I said, holding it up, this document you handed to the BF. You claim this was proof of your filing, but your father just told us the case is closed and everything is digital. So what is this really? I looked closely at the paper. It was a good forgery. I'll give him that high-quality paper. But now that I knew what to look for, the cracks appeared. This is an old receipt, isn't it? I asked. You altered the date. You used your legal skills that are supposed to be used to uphold the truth to manufacture evidence. In the legal world, Mr. Prescott, we have a word for a lawyer who alters documents and lies to a tribunal, Alexander whispered. Disbarred. That's right, I said. Disbarred. You are a third-year law student. You are months away from taking the bar exam, and you just committed a felony in open court over a traffic ticket. You turned a $200 fine into a career-ending event. Alexander finally broke. The confident litigator was gone. In his place was a scared boy, realizing his life was about to derail. Judge Caprio, please, he stammered, his voice cracking. I panicked. I have a clean record. I'm top of my class. I have an offer from a top firm in New York. If this goes on my record, if this gets out, I lose everything. I'll withdraw the motions. I'll pay the fine. I'll pay double the fine. Just please don't report this. He was begging now, bargaining. He thought this was a negotiation. He still didn't get it. He thought the problem was the record, not the act itself. You're worried about your job offer? I asked, incredulous. Mr. Prescott, you drove a 3,000 lubby weapon at 80 mebilaries past human beings who were working to feed their families. If you had sneezed, if a tire had blown, you would have killed someone. And your concern right now is your job offer. I looked at the gallery. I saw the faces of regular people, nurses, mechanics, teachers who had come in, admitted their mistakes, and asked for mercy. They didn't have Harvard degrees. They didn't have federal judge fathers, but they had something Alexander lacked: integrity. You stand there and ask me to bury this because you have a bright future, I said. But what about the future of the construction worker you almost hit? What about the integrity of the court you tried to defraud? I turned to the bailiff. Secure that receipt. It is now Exhibit A in a criminal investigation for perjury and tampering with evidence. Alexander grabbed the edge of the table. Criminal, Your Honor, please. My father. Your father, I interrupted, is the one who told me to do what I have to do. He knows that the integrity of the law is more important than his son's ego, and I think he knows that if you become a lawyer with this kind of character, you will be a danger to society. I leaned back. I could have ended it there. I could have had him arrested right then and there, but I saw something in his face. Panic, yes, but also a complete lack of understanding of why this was happening. He still thought this was just a bad strategic move, a failed debate tactic. He didn't feel the weight of his actions. He just felt the fear of consequences. I needed him to feel the weight. I'm not going to have you arrested today, Mr. Prescott, I said. Alexander let out a breath, his shoulders sagging in relief. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you. I save your thanks, I said coldly. I'm not arresting you because that's too easy. You'd call a lawyer, you'd make bail, and you'd learn nothing. You need to understand what reckless endangerment actually means. You treated those construction workers like traffic cones, obstacles in your way. I motioned to the bailiff. Bring in Mr. Henderson. Alexander looked confused. Who? The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A man walked in. He was wearing a neon yellow safety vest covered in dust. He walked with a limp, leaning heavily on a cane. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a judge. He was a man who worked with his hands. Mr. Prescott, I said, meet the man who was working in that zone you sped through. Meet the man whose life you gambled with for a poker game. Mr. Henderson walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. The sound of his cane hitting the floor, click, step, was the only noise in the room. He stopped a few feet from Alexander. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. He took off his dust-covered hard hat and held it in rough, calloused hands that were the exact opposite of Alexander's manicured fingers. Mr. Henderson, I said softly, thank you for coming in on such short notice. I know you're in the middle of a shift. It's all right, Your Honor, Gary Henderson replied, his voice growly. We had to stop work anyway. Someone knocked over half our safety barriers about an hour ago. I looked at Alexander. He flinched. Mr. Prescott, I said, my voice hard, look at him. Alexander hesitated. He tried to look at the table, at the floor, anywhere but at the man in the neon vest. I said, look at him, I commanded. Alexander slowly raised his head. He looked at Gary Henderson.